Donna Prescott phoned the police 12 separate times over 5 weeks, insisting that the black single father living beside her was an intruder, a burglar, and a menace to the neighborhood. During the last of those calls, a sergeant hemmed in Harrison Noble's car right in front of his 8-year-old daughter, kept his palm hovering over his holster, and shoved open the file boxes sitting in the trunk. Harrison didn't flinch. He flipped open his leather wallet and let the gold badge inside catch the light. The color drained from the sergeant's face as he snapped to attention. So who had Donna actually been going after this whole time? If you've ever seen someone condemned before they'd even opened their mouth, keep watching this one. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss where this leads. Harrison Noble had spent 26 years learning how to size up a room before he ever spoke a single word in it. And the second he steered the moving truck onto Briarwood Lane, he read this one without even trying. Curtains twitched behind windows all along the street. A man out walking his golden retriever eased his stride just enough to get a good look. None of this caught Harrison off guard. What did catch him off guard was how badly he wanted this street specifically to feel like something different. Because for the first time since his daughter Maya had been born, he'd bought her a house with a yard roomy enough for a swing set and a bedroom window that opened onto a magnolia tree instead of a parking lot. Maya was 8, all elbows and restless energy, and she claimed that window before Harrison had even carried the first box past the threshold. She climbed onto the bare mattress frame, pressed her hand flat against the glass, and declared that this would be the room where she'd draw flowers on the sidewalk every day until the whole block looked like a garden. Harrison couldn't help smiling at that. After years crammed into an apartment in Durham, after raising her solo since her mother left when Maya was barely 2, he'd sworn to himself that someday he'd give her a home that felt lasting. Watching her claim that window felt like that promise finally coming true. What none of Harrison's new neighbors on Briarwood Lane realized was that the soft-spoken man in the worn work shirt hauling boxes alongside his daughter had been unanimously named the incoming police chief of Cedarfield just 11 days before. The announcement had run in the local paper with no photo attached, tucked between a notice about a road closure and a school board update. His formal swearing in, along with his introduction to every officer serving under him, was still weeks off, deliberately delayed so the outgoing chief could wrap up his remaining cases properly. Until then, Harrison had decided to work out of a temporary office at City Hall instead of the station itself, so the handover could happen smoothly. That meant that outside of the council members who'd voted for him and a couple of office assistants, not one patrol officer in Cedarfield had ever laid eyes on him. Harrison's plan had been straightforward: settle in quietly, get Maya adjusted before school started, and leave the badge tucked in his jacket pocket until it was time to wear it for real. He'd spent his whole career watching how authority changed people's behavior around him, how officers straightened up and softened their words the moment they realized who he was. He wanted a handful of normal weeks before that shift happened again. He had no idea yet how fast that plan would run headlong into the woman next door. Donna Prescott headed the Briarwood Estates Homeowners Association for 9 years, and over that stretch, she'd stopped thinking of the neighborhood as simply where she lived and started treating it as territory she ruled. If she were being honest with herself, which she rarely allowed, it was the last thing in her life she still had full command over. Her real estate agency had been swallowed up by a bigger firm the previous year, taking most of her clients with her. Her only son had put down roots in New York and phoned twice a month if she was fortunate. Her marriage had settled into something closer to a shared address than an actual partnership. The HOA newsletter, the landscaping rules, the committee that approved exterior paint colors, these were the last strings Donna could still tug and see something happen. So when a black family pulled a moving truck up to the first house sold on Briarwood Lane in over 20 years, Donna didn't see new neighbors. She saw a threat to the one corner of her life she still had control over. She was already cutting across the lawn before Harrison had even set the first box on the porch.
Maya was lining up her stuffed animals along the railing, humming to herself, when Donna's shadow fell over the steps. Donna demanded, without so much as a hello, to know what exactly Harrison thought he was doing in someone else's house. Harrison stood up straight, wiped his hands on his jeans, and explained calmly that he had bought the property and that he and his daughter were moving in. Donna's gaze traveled from his work shirt to the moving truck to Maya's scattered toys, and whatever passed across her face made it clear his explanation hadn't shifted her opinion one bit. She kicked a bag of Maya's folded clothes off the top step as she spun around, scattering shirts and socks into the grass, then yanked out her phone and dialed 911 before Harrison could get another word out. She told the dispatcher a man and a child were breaking into a house belonging to somebody else. Within minutes, a patrol car pulled up with lights flashing, and Officer Kyle Brennan climbed out, already flipping open his notepad. He asked Harrison for ID, proof he owned the place, and confirmation that Maya was in fact his own child, all while the 8-year-old stood frozen on the porch, hugging a stuffed rabbit to her chest. She'd never before had to watch her father justify his own presence somewhere, and the bewilderment on her face hit Harrison harder than anything Brennan asked him. Harrison worked through the questions methodically, checking the name on his license against the name on the deed, even asking Maya her own name and age, as if an 8-year-old could somehow be coached under pressure. Harrison answered each question without letting his voice rise, knowing full well that any flicker of frustration from him would be read very differently than the same frustration from a white homeowner standing on his own porch. Once everything checked out, Brennan apologized, welcomed them to the block, and got back into his car. Donna, though, hadn't budged from the edge of her lawn. She shouted that a piece of paper didn't make a man fit to live in Briarwood Estates, and reminded Harrison, loud enough for the whole street to hear, that she had ties to the association, the city council, and the police department itself. She said she'd see to it he was gone before his first month was over. Harrison carried the last box inside without a word. He'd stood in front of hostile crowds before, talked down armed suspects and grieving families in the same week, and he understood instinctively that snapping back at Donna would only hand her a story to tell. What he didn't yet grasp was how far she was prepared to take it.
2 days later, the second call came in. Donna reported a suspicious vehicle circling the block, describing Harrison's Ford Explorer right down to the plate number. In reality, the truck had been sitting, parked in his own driveway, engine off, since the night before. A patrol car checked it out, found nothing, and left without incident, but Harrison logged the timestamp anyway, a habit 26 years of training had drilled into him. The third call came 2 afternoons after that, when Maya put on music while unpacking her room and danced across the floor in her socks. Donna reported a disturbance. After the officers left that time, Maya switched the stereo off herself and didn't turn it back on for nearly a week, quietly telling her father she was afraid the woman next door would call the police again if she so much as heard a song. The fourth call happened when a black contractor showed up to install Maya's bed frame and shelving. Donna described a suspicious man hauling tools into the Noble house, implying he might be scoping the place out for a burglary. Officers arrived while the contractor was still mid-installation. Humiliated and unwilling to invite more trouble, he packed up and left before finishing the job, leaving Maya's bookshelves half-built against her wall for another 2 weeks. By that point, Harrison understood none of this was innocent confusion. Donna wasn't making honest mistakes about a new family on her street. She was systematically twisting the most mundane pieces of her daughter's life, a parked car, a pop song, a piece of furniture, into supposed proof of a danger that existed only inside her own head. That night, after Maya had drifted off, he weighed his options. He could walk next door, flash his badge, and watch her fear flip instantly into apology. That would shut down the calls in a single conversation. But it would also end just as fast any chance he had of seeing what his own officers did when they believed nobody above them was watching.
Cedarfield had brought him in precisely because the department needed reform, because years of unanswered complaints about racial profiling and excessive force had piled up. If he revealed his badge now, he'd only ever see the department putting on a show for its incoming chief, never see how it truly treated the people it was sworn to serve. So Harrison held back. He started keeping a private log on his phone, tracking the time of each call, which officer responded, and what came of it, confident that if Donna kept it up, her own overreach would eventually add up to a pattern too obvious for anyone to wave away. He didn't yet know how many more calls it would take, or how close to his daughter Donna would eventually get. He only knew that before he ever pinned that badge back on, he needed to understand exactly what kind of department he was inheriting. The log Harrison had begun keeping after the fourth call stayed open on his phone almost every night now, a quiet running record of how the department he was about to take over treated people without a badge. He'd promised himself he'd give it time, and time was exactly what Donna kept turning against him. The fifth call landed on a Saturday morning, the kind of morning Harrison had been looking forward to ever since they'd signed on the house. The air still held its early coolness. The street was mostly empty, apart from a couple of joggers and a man trimming his hedges 2 doors down. And for a few minutes, it almost felt like the ordinary weekend Harrison had promised his daughter back when he first showed her the listing photos. He headed out for his usual run while Maya pedaled beside him on her bike, her helmet a size too big and sliding forward every few yards, giggling every time she had to shove it back with her forearm instead of stopping. Donna watched from her window long enough to tell the dispatcher a man was moving aggressively through the neighborhood with a child in tow, under what she called concerning circumstances. There was nothing aggressive about the pace Harrison held, an easy jog he could have kept up for miles. But by the time Brennan's cruiser rounded the corner, Maya had already noticed the shift in her father's posture, the way his shoulders tensed the instant he heard sirens, even before he spotted the lights. Brennan recognized Harrison from the week before and waved off the call within seconds, offering an apologetic half-shrug before driving off. But Maya had already stopped pedaling, one foot planted on the curb, watching the patrol car pull away with a look Harrison didn't like seeing on an 8-year-old. She asked him, once the officer had left, why the police kept turning up every single time they stepped outside. Harrison crouched to her eye level, still catching his breath, and told her officers were there to keep people safe. The same line he'd given a dozen families over the years whenever a call turned out to be nothing. He heard how hollow it sounded even as he said it, watching her chew the strap of her helmet the way she did when working something out in her head, and he realized his own daughter was starting to hear exactly what he heard every time a cruiser turned onto their street. The sixth call arrived a few days later when Harrison had a meeting at City Hall and asked his younger sister Olivia to look after Maya for the afternoon. Olivia had done this dozens of times since Maya was a toddler in diapers, and there was nothing about it that should have raised anyone's eyebrows. She arrived a bit into the afternoon, let herself in with the spare key Harrison had given her, and settled onto the couch with Maya to watch cartoons, the two of them splitting a bowl of popcorn, with Maya narrating each episode as though Olivia had never seen it. Donna, spotting an unfamiliar black woman letting herself into the house while Harrison's car was gone, called to report a stranger alone with a child while the homeowner was away. Officers showed up at the door within an hour, asking Olivia for ID and questioning her connection to Maya as if she might be a total stranger who'd walked off the street with a key she had no business holding. Olivia answered every question calmly, though her jaw stayed tight the whole time, and produced her license along with a photo on her phone of her holding Maya as a newborn. Nothing came of it, no citation, no further action, but Maya sat through the whole exchange feeling like her own living room had turned into an interrogation room, curled into the corner of the couch with her knees drawn to her chest, while 2 officers stood in the doorway demanding her aunt prove she belonged there. She didn't fully relax again until her father walked through the door that evening, and even then she asked him twice whether Aunt Olivia was still allowed to come back, as though the visit itself might have counted as some kind of violation rather than an ordinary afternoon with family. Olivia brought it up lightly to Harrison once Maya had gone to bed, the way people do when they're trying to keep something from sounding heavier than it feels. But Harrison caught the strain underneath it. His sister had spent her whole life watching him face this exact kind of scrutiny throughout her career, and standing on the receiving end of it, in what was supposed to be her own family's house, felt different.
The seventh call hit harder than the first 6 combined. Harrison decided Maya deserved something normal after weeks of feeling watched, so he invited 2 of her new classmates over for a small backyard dinner, the kind of low-key get-together that happened on porches and patios all over Briarwood Estates without anyone thinking twice. He grilled burgers on the small charcoal grill he'd picked up the weekend they moved in. The kids played a chaotic round of charades on the lawn, shrieking with laughter every time someone guessed wrong. And for the first time since they'd moved in, the house was full of laughter instead of tension. Donna reported noise, smoke, and unsupervised children, and a patrol car showed up out front less than 20 minutes into the meal, its light sweeping silently across the lawn where 3 kids had just been mid-game. The other parents arrived early to pick up their kids, polite but clearly eager to avoid any further run-in with the police, thanking Harrison for having their daughters over, already steering them toward the car. Within the week, Maya noticed she'd stopped getting invited to a couple of the play dates she used to look forward to, and nobody offered an explanation from either side. Harrison understood well enough on his own that Donna wasn't just harassing him anymore. She was quietly severing his daughter's ties to the only friendships she'd managed to form at a brand new school, one uneasy parent at a time. That night he sat with Maya longer than usual, running his thumb along the edge of her comforter while she asked why some of her friends had stopped texting her. He told her the truth as gently as he could, that sometimes adults make choices out of fear that have nothing to do with anything a child actually did. Maya nodded slowly, the way kids do when they understand more than they can put into words, and Harrison lay awake afterward, turning over just how much damage one neighbor's phone calls had already done before anyone with real authority had bothered to take notice. The 8th call came at night, and it was the one that finally cracked something open in him. Harrison had just tucked Maya in and gone outside to drag the trash cans to the curb ahead of Monday's pickup. It was a little past 9, an ordinary chore he'd done 1,000 times in 1,000 different neighborhoods, and Donna reported a suspicious man wandering in front of the houses on the block. This time, the call didn't go to Brennan. It went to Sergeant Dale Furman, a heavyset officer with 2 decades on the force, and, though Harrison didn't know it yet, a reputation for trusting his gut over his training. Furman had built his whole career on the belief that he could spot a threat before it announced itself, an instinct that had earned him 3 commendations over the years, and quietly a stack of complaints from residents who'd learned the hard way what that instinct tended to look like whenever the person in front of him was black. Furman's headlight swept across the driveway and froze Harrison in place before he'd even set the second can down. The sergeant stepped out with one hand already resting near his holster and a flashlight aimed straight into Harrison's eyes, close enough that Harrison could hear his own breathing over the idling engine and feel the heat of the beam on his face. Harrison explained evenly, without any sudden movement, that he lived in the house behind him and was simply taking out the trash, keeping both hands visible at his sides, the way he'd trained hundreds of officers to expect from a nervous civilian. Furman didn't lower the light. Instead, he said the department had been fielding repeated complaints about this particular address and suggested, in a tone that left no room for debate, that Harrison might want to think harder about how he presented himself after dark. Nothing in the exchange would show up on any report as misconduct. No raised voice, no explicit threat. Just a grown man standing in his own driveway being told to make himself smaller and less visible in his own neighborhood. From her bedroom window, Maya watched the whole thing unfold in the glow of the patrol car's headlights. She crept down the stairs in her socks, stood behind the front door, and asked her father through the crack whether the police were going to take him away. It was the first time she'd ever asked that out loud, and it was the moment Harrison stopped treating this as simply a case he was building against Donna. Standing in his own driveway, with his daughter's frightened voice behind him, he understood the problem reached far past one bitter neighbor. Officers kept taking Donna at her word without checking a single claim. Calls that had already been proven baseless never got connected into a pattern anyone bothered to examine. A grown man taking out his own trash in front of his own house had just been treated like a threat, and the only reason it hadn't gone further was luck, not policy. These officers had no idea who Harrison really was, which meant every one of these encounters was showing him exactly how they treated people who carried no badge. Harrison knew that revealing his identity right there in the driveway would have ended the confrontation instantly. It wouldn't have ended the pattern. So instead of raising his voice or pulling out his own credentials, he simply nodded, said goodnight, and hauled the second can to the curb while Furman watched him the whole way. Once he was back inside with the door locked, he sat at the kitchen table and kept writing, now determined to gather enough evidence that the department would have no choice but to change, not just apologize for one bad night. He thought about the stack of complaints waiting for him at City Hall, the excessive force file he'd already reviewed twice before taking the job, the community meetings where residents described being stopped, questioned, and searched for reasons that never held up. He'd told the council during his final interview that reform couldn't be built from behind a desk. It had to come from understanding what an ordinary encounter with this department actually felt like when neither side knew who held the power. Standing in his own driveway that night, badge still folded away in his jacket pocket, Harrison finally grasped the true shape of the problem he'd been hired to fix, because he was living inside it. The ninth call came about a week later, and this time Donna went after something that belonged entirely to Maya. It was a warm afternoon, and Maya had settled onto the front walkway with a box of sidewalk chalk, sketching a magnolia tree, a little house, and two stick figures holding hands, the exact picture she'd promised herself she'd draw the very first day she claimed her bedroom window. She'd been at it nearly an hour, humming the way she did when proud of something, adding little touches like leaves on the tree and a yellow sun in the corner. Donna crossed over uninvited and announced the drawings were dragging down the neighborhood's appearance. Before Maya could say anything, Donna ground her shoe into several chalk sticks scattered on the pavement and dragged her foot across part of the picture, smearing the two stick figures into a gray blur on the concrete. Maya froze, chalk still in hand, staring up at the woman looming over her drawing. When she finally spoke up, her voice small but indignant, Donna called the police herself, accusing an 8-year-old child of vandalizing shared association property, as if the child had taken spray paint to a public wall. Brennan handled that one over the phone, confirming the section of walkway in question sat entirely inside the noble's own property line, and closed the complaint as unfounded within minutes, his voice tight with something close to embarrassment by the time he relayed the outcome to Harrison. Maya, though, didn't go back outside to finish the drawing. She gathered the broken chalk pieces into their box, sealed the lid carefully, as though the chalk might still be worth saving for some day, and slid it under her bed, where it sat untouched for the next several days, while the smeared half of her picture faded slowly under the afternoon sun. The 10th call was the one that changed everything. Maya's ball rolled toward the property line a few days after the chalk incident, and she jogged over to grab it the way she had a dozen times before, without a second thought about which side of an invisible line it had landed on. Donna stepped into her path before she reached it, telling the girl children like her needed to learn where they belonged, her voice flat and deliberate in a way that left no doubt she meant it. Maya tried to sidestep her and head home, suddenly unsure of herself in a way she hadn't been a moment before, but Donna grabbed her by the wrist, gripping hard enough to leave a mark, and demanded she call her father outside.
Harrison heard Maya's voice rise in alarm from inside the house and was out the front door before he'd had time to think about anything except reaching her. He found Donna's hand still wrapped around his daughter's wrist, Maya's face caught somewhere between fear and confusion. For one long second, Harrison felt every year of his training strain against something far more immediate than professional restraint. Every muscle in his body wanted to close the distance between them in a single stride. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't shove Donna away, though every instinct urged him to. He simply nodded, said goodnight, and guided Maya back inside, and photographed the red mark already forming on her wrist before it could fade, his hand steadier than he felt. Maya sat on her bed afterwards, clutching the box of broken chalk to her chest, and asked her father a question that would stick with him longer than anything Furman or Donna had ever said to him directly. "Does she hate me because I look like you?" Harrison didn't have an answer ready. For the first time since the calls had started, he felt his composure slip, not from anger at Donna, but from the unbearable weight of watching his daughter absorb a hatred she'd done nothing to earn. He thought of every case file he'd reviewed over the years where a child carried something like this quietly for months before anyone noticed, and he promised himself Maya wouldn't become another name buried in a folder. Every instinct in him wanted to use the authority sitting untouched in his jacket pocket to make Donna answer for what she'd just done. But even in that moment, he understood that if he stepped in personally before any independent process existed, Donna would have every excuse to claim the new police chief had used his position for a private act of revenge against a neighbor, and any real reckoning she deserved would get dismissed as nothing more than a grudge. He sat with Maya until she fell asleep that night, the box of broken chalk still tucked against her side, and lingered in her doorway long after her breathing evened out, turning over how much longer he could afford to wait before the badge came out of his pocket for good.
That same night, Brennan finished his report on the 10th call, and this time he couldn't simply file it away as one more baseless complaint the way he had with the others before it. An adult had physically restrained a minor against her will, and there was a photo to back it up, a detail he knew would matter far more than anything he'd scribbled about parked cars or backyard barbecues. He sat at his desk long after his shift technically ended, rereading his own wording 3 separate times before he was satisfied it captured exactly what he'd seen at that house. He documented that Donna's complaint itself was baseless, that an 8-year-old had been grabbed by the wrist hard enough to bruise, that this marked the 10th call against the same family in 4 weeks, and that the matter needed to go to the Criminal Investigations Division and the District Attorney's Office for review of possible charges tied to the physical restraint of a minor. It was the first time in 10 calls that an officer had put the whole truth on paper and pushed it somewhere it couldn't quietly vanish, and part of him already suspected it wouldn't make him popular with the sergeant who usually decided which complaints were worth taking seriously. The 11th call wasn't a call at all, but Donna clearly felt the need to escalate anyway. She sat at her kitchen table one evening and wrote out a 3-page letter by hand before typing it up properly, addressed jointly to the city council, the mayor's office, and the incoming chief of police, describing Harrison as an unfit father who left his daughter unsupervised and created a dangerous environment for the neighborhood. She wrote about the chalk drawings, the backyard dinner, the contractor's tools, weaving 10 unrelated afternoons into a single narrative of parental neglect and lurking danger, each detail chosen because it sounded worse stripped of its context. She demanded the new chief of police personally investigate the family and pushed the Homeowners Association to explore every possible way of forcing them out of Briarwood Estates, invoking her 9 years as chair as though the title alone should settle it. She signed the letter with her position spelled out in full beneath her name and mailed 3 separate copies to make sure no one could claim it had gone unnoticed, sealing each envelope with the quiet satisfaction of a woman certain she was finally about to win. She had no idea that the very chief of police she was begging to intervene on her behalf lived less than 20 feet from her own front door,
ate breakfast every morning within sight of her kitchen window, and had already read, in his own handwriting, every one of the 10 reports she'd generated against his family. The 12th call came the very next morning, the day before Harrison's official department-wide introduction, the last quiet morning he had left before every officer in Cedarfield would finally know his face. He'd woken early, packed lunches, and gotten Maya's backpack ready while she ate cereal at the counter, running through his mental checklist for the meeting ahead, unaware that this ordinary morning was about to become the most dangerous of the entire 5 weeks he'd spent on Briarwood Lane. He was loading boxes into the trunk of his car before dropping Maya at school and heading to City Hall, boxes full of personnel files, internal reports, and budget documents he'd been reviewing ahead of his first full day leading the department. Donna watched from her window and called it in immediately, telling the dispatcher a man was loading boxes of stolen property into his vehicle. This time the call went to Furman, and Furman didn't hesitate. He swung his patrol car directly into the mouth of the driveway, blocking any way out, while Maya sat buckled into the back seat of the Explorer, backpack already on her shoulders, waiting for her father to finish loading the trunk. Furman stepped out and ordered Harrison away from the vehicle, both hands up. When Harrison tried to explain his daughter was still inside the car, Furman told him to stay quiet and rested his hand on his holster. Maya pressed her palm against the window, tears already sliding down her face as she called out for her father, and Harrison felt the entire situation tip towards something he could no longer manage through patience alone. Furman demanded he open every box in the trunk. When Harrison told him the boxes held department files, Furman let out a short, disbelieving laugh and kicked one hard enough to send confidential documents scattering across the driveway, pages sliding across the concrete and catching against the curb.
Harrison stood in the single most dangerous moment of the entire 5-week ordeal, and he understood every piece of it with the clarity of 26 years spent reading exactly these situations from the other side of the badge. An armed sergeant, tense and one radio call away from summoning backup, stood a few feet from him with adrenaline already overriding his judgment. His daughter was trapped in the car, watching her father treated like a criminal in broad daylight on the very street where she'd drawn a picture of the two of them holding hands. Sensitive department files lay scattered on the pavement between them, personnel records with nothing to do with any of this. One misread movement could turn Furman's hand from his holster to his weapon, and staying silent any longer risked putting both himself and Maya in far greater danger than speaking up ever would. Harrison moved his hand slowly toward his back pocket. Furman's grip tightened on his holster, and he barked at Harrison not to move. Maya slammed her palm against the glass, sobbing out the only word that mattered to her in that instant. "Dad!" Harrison went still, looked at his daughter through the window, and spoke each word clearly enough that there could be no mistaking it. "I'm reaching for my identification." He pulled out his leather wallet, opened it, and revealed the gold badge inside, engraved with the words Chief of Police, Cedarfield Police Department. He held Furman's stare without blinking. "My name is Harrison Noble. I'm your new chief." Furman went completely still. His hand dropped away from the holster on its own, and the color drained from his face within seconds. The same face that a moment earlier had worn nothing but suspicion was now hollowed out with the sudden understanding of exactly what he'd just done. Realizing he'd kicked confidential department files across the pavement and threatened the incoming chief of police in front of the man's own daughter, Furman dropped to his knees and began gathering the scattered papers with visibly shaking hands, fumbling twice before managing to stack them into any kind of order. Harrison told him to leave everything exactly where it was. Furman rose anyway and raised his hand in an automatic salute, the gesture arriving a full beat too late to mean anything. "Chief Noble, sir."
Harrison didn't return the gesture. He walked past him instead, opened the back door of the Explorer, and crouched down to Maya's level, wiping the tears from her cheeks with his thumb, and telling her in the same steady voice he'd used with Furman that everything was all right now and that she was safe. Only once she'd stopped shaking did he straighten up and turn back to the sergeant, still standing rigid in the driveway. He told Furman that every report from all 12 calls needed to be on his desk before noon, and this conversation was far from over. Across the street on her own porch, Donna watched Furman standing at rigid attention in front of the very man she'd spent 5 weeks describing as a trespasser, a thief, and a father unfit to live among decent people. She'd been holding a cup of coffee, and it slipped from her hand the moment the badge caught the morning light, shattering against the tile at her feet in a spray of dark liquid and broken porcelain. She didn't move to clean it up. She stood frozen on her own porch, watching a sergeant salute the man she'd just spent an entire letter trying to destroy, and for the first time in 5 weeks, the ground beneath her certainty gave way completely. The neighbor she'd spent weeks trying to drive out of Briarwood Estates was the very police chief she'd just begged in her own handwriting to come to her rescue. Inside the Explorer, Maya wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve and watched her father through the window, still not entirely sure what she'd just witnessed, only that the badge in her hand had made the frightening man with the flashlight go quiet in a way nothing else had. Harrison closed the trunk, checked once more that every scattered file had been left exactly where Furman dropped it, and got into the driver's seat beside his daughter, aware that the hardest part of the morning still lay ahead. Somewhere between the driveway and the school drop-off line, he'd need to find an answer for the question he already knew Maya was going to ask him. Harrison drove Maya to school in silence for the first few minutes, both of them still catching their breath from what had just happened in the driveway. The radio stayed off, and neither of them reached to turn it on. The quiet inside the car felt steadier than anything either of them could have said out loud. Before she climbed out, she turned back to him with a question that landed harder than anything Furman had said all morning. "You're the police chief, so why do the police still treat you like you're bad?" Harrison didn't have a simple answer for that, and he refused to insult her with one. He told her only that some people in the department still had a lot to learn about treating others fairly, and that he intended to make sure they learned it. Watching her walk toward the school doors, backpack slung over one shoulder, he understood the hardest part of what came next wasn't proving Donna wrong or removing Furman from his post. The real test was convincing his own daughter that the badge could still mean something like justice after everything she'd watched it fail to protect. At his temporary office in City Hall, Harrison laid out all 12 reports in the order the calls had come, reading through them one after another instead of skimming for highlights, forcing himself to sit with every detail instead of rushing toward the conclusion he already knew was waiting for him. A suspected break-in that was really a family moving into their own home. A parked car mistaken for surveillance, a dance party mistaken for a disturbance, a contractor mistaken for a burglar casing the block, a jog mistaken for a threat, a babysitter mistaken for a stranger, a birthday dinner mistaken for chaos, a man taking out his trash mistaken for a prowler, a child's chalk drawing mistaken for vandalism, a grabbed wrist explained away until a photograph made denial impossible, a 3-page letter dressed up as concern for the neighborhood, a trunk full of department files mistaken for stolen property, 12 separate stories told over 5 long weeks, each one building toward the same conclusion, that a black family's presence on Briarwood Lane was itself something to fear, question, and report.
Harrison had spent his career studying patterns exactly like this one from the outside, reviewing complaint logs and use of force reports as a professional exercise in identifying what had gone wrong. Sitting with his own name and his daughter's photograph attached to every page made the weight of it land differently than any file ever had before. He called Brennan into his office that afternoon, keeping the tone closer to a conversation than an interrogation. Brennan admitted, without being pushed very hard, that he'd suspected Donna's motives as early as the third call, but hadn't said anything louder than quietly closing the file, because Furman had warned him early on that Donna had connections and that crossing her would only cause trouble for the department. Harrison set the 10th report on the desk between them, the one where Brennan had finally written down the full truth and pushed it toward a real investigation instead of quietly closing it. "That report is the reason we have a case at all," Harrison told him. "Don't let it be the last time you speak up when you already know something's wrong." He didn't excuse Brennan's earlier silence, but he gave him something more useful than a reprimand, a reason to believe that telling the truth on paper could still matter inside this department. Brennan left the office that day looking like a man determined to prove it. Furman's meeting went differently, and Harrison could tell within the first minute the sergeant had spent the whole morning rehearsing his defense. Furman tried to explain that Donna was a well-respected figure who'd chaired the association for 9 years, and that the department had always given her calls priority without much scrutiny, as though habit alone could excuse how far it had gone. Harrison let him finish every word before answering, his voice even and unhurried. "You believed her because she's white, wealthy, and loud. You suspected me because I'm black, quiet, and you didn't know I had power." He reminded Furman that not knowing Harrison was the incoming chief should never have been the reason to treat him decently. A man doesn't need a badge to deserve being treated like a human being. Furman had no answer for that. He was suspended, stripped of his badge and weapon, and placed under review pending a full internal investigation, and he left the building that afternoon without the salute he'd offered so quickly in the driveway. Harrison, though, didn't order Donna's arrest himself. To keep the case from looking like one father's personal act of retaliation, he handed over every piece of evidence to the district attorney's office and requested an independent investigation entirely outside his own department's control, insisting the case stand or fall on the facts alone, rather than on the authority of the man bringing them forward. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Whitmore took the case from there, building a thorough file that included all 12 recorded calls, the officers' written reports, the photograph of the bruise on Maya's wrist, and the 3-page letter Donna had signed and mailed under her own name. Investigators went further, pulling Donna's full call history across her 9 years chairing the association, and what they found went far beyond the Noble family. Donna had placed 84 calls to the police over those 9 years, and 71 of them had targeted people of color, a pattern spanning delivery drivers, landscapers, a Latino mail carrier, a black real estate agent, and a plumber named Willis Hartman, who'd once been detained for 20 minutes while fixing a pipe for a paying customer, and afterward refused to take any more jobs in Briarwood Estates, losing 3 clients in the process. One family, Patricia Coleman and her husband, had lived in the neighborhood 14 months before selling their home after 9 consecutive complaints from Donna. Association records showed 31 violation notices issued during her tenure, every single one directed at the same 4 non-white households, while white homeowners with comparable violations were never cited at all. Whitmore laid the pattern out methodically, year by year, until 9 years of quiet complaints finally read as exactly what they were, a sustained, deliberate campaign rather than a string of interrelated misunderstandings. When journalist Megan Sullivan broke the story, it spread quickly beyond Cedarfield, picked up by national outlets within days, transforming what had started as a quiet dispute between 2 neighbors into a case study cited in newsrooms and city council chambers far outside North Carolina. At a packed community meeting held in the high school gymnasium, Harrison appeared in uniform but didn't make himself the center of the evening.
He stepped away from the podium early and handed the microphone to the people Donna had spent years targeting, letting Willis, the Colemans, and others describe in their own words what it cost them to live, work, or simply pass through Briarwood Estates under Donna's watch. Several longtime residents admitted publicly for the first time that they'd noticed the pattern years earlier and said nothing, choosing comfort over confrontation for far too long. Donna was charged with 12 counts of filing false police reports motivated by racial bias, along with a separate charge tied to her physical restraint of a minor during the 10th call. In court, she offered what looked like remorse, sitting with her hands folded and her head bowed at the defense table, but prosecutors played the recordings back one after another, each call carrying the same flat certainty as she described Harrison as a trespasser, a thief, and a dangerous father. Any sympathy the jury might have extended dissolved somewhere around the 6th recording, when her own voice made it clear this had never been confusion. The jury convicted her on 8 of the 12 counts. Donna received 18 months of probation, a $15,000 fine, 200 hours of community service, mandatory enrollment in a bias intervention program, a no-contact order regarding Harrison and Maya, and a restriction keeping her at least 500 feet from their home. Donna's house sat empty for 3 months before a young family bought it. On the day they moved in, Harrison and Maya walked over with a loaf of banana bread and a fresh box of sidewalk chalk for the family's youngest child, a small gesture Maya had insisted on herself, certain that every new family on the street deserved a warmer welcome than the one she and her father had received. No one watched from behind a curtain. No one questioned how they'd come to own their home. No one called the police. Harrison didn't deserve respect because he carried the title of chief. He deserved it because he was a father caring for his daughter inside the walls of his own home, the same way any parent on that street deserved to be trusted without having to prove it 12 times over, without a badge, without a title, and without needing to explain himself in his own driveway. Power can help a person protect himself, but real justice only exists when the same system also protects the people who hold no title, no wealth, and no badge at all. If this story moved you, the truest way to honor it is simple. Treat the next stranger you meet the way you'd want your own family treated, badge or no badge. If you believe stories like Harrison's deserve to be told, subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who needs the reminder that dignity should never depend on what someone else assumes about you.